The king had donkey's ears. Shh. No one was supposed to know about it, and the only person that knew about the king's donkey's ears was his hairdresser, because the king had his head bound up in a headband and his ears tucked away, but of course had to take them away when it came to having his hair cut. And the king made the hairdresser promise in no uncertain terms that he would keep the secret. In fact, the king made sure that the hairdresser knew that if he told the secret to anybody else, the king would make him shorter by a head. Well, you can imagine that the hairdresser became very good at keeping secrets. He kept that secret of the king's donkey ears inside him, held tightly for a week, for a month, for a year. For 10 years, the secret was kept inside, telling no one. But if you keep a secret inside for too long, then it can start to fester. And it started to make the poor hairdresser feel unwell until eventually he was confined to his bed. His skin was ashen grey, his eyes hardly open. The doctor was called, and she came, and with stethoscopes in her ears, she listened to the hairdresser and said, "You've got a secret held inside you. You need to let that secret go, or if you don't, you'll surely die. But if I do tell my secret, the king will find out, and I will definitely die." "Well," said the wise doctor, "this is what you can do. You can go and tell your story, your secret, to a tree." Well, he gradually eased himself out of bed and went to the nearest part of the forest, where he found an old tree. And sitting down next to the tree, he found a piece of bark that looked a little bit like an ear. And then he went up to the tree, strange to tell, and he whispered the story into the tree. And as soon as he did, as soon as he told of the king's donkey's ears, the hairdresser felt like a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He felt well again, and off down the road he skipped back to his house. And it was on the same autumn day, coming from the other direction, down the path towards the forest, towards the same tree, there was a band of musicians, a company of players that were going to play their music in the halls of the king themselves. They had prepared the music ready for the king. And so they stopped the night before they arrived at the king's palace to camp in the woods and to spend a bit of time rehearsing their tunes. And the lead musician was going to be the flute player, a specially composed tune on the flute. But as he rested underneath the tree, he realized his own wooden flute had been broken on the journey. And so looking around into the tree, he saw a little branch, the right shape and the right size, that could be hollowed and carved into a brand new flute. He climbed the tree, he took the branch, he came back all night, he hollowed it and carved it and made it special and ready to play. And then he tucked it carefully in his pocket the next day. As they arrived in the halls of the king with all the posh people ready to receive the musicians playing in front of the king, the flute player stood up to play the very first concerto of the music. He took a deep breath, he lifted up his flute and he blew. "The king's got donkey's ears" came out of the flute. The king was red in the face. He clenched his fist with anger. "The hairdresser, bring me the hairdresser. He must have told the story to the musician." The hairdresser came. The musician looked, but they'd never seen each other. The musician said that "There's no one that told me this secret. The only way it could have come is from the tree itself." And the hairdresser said, "Well, in fact, it's true. I did tell my story not to anybody else, but to this tree." And when the king realized the story had come from the tree, he smiled, and as he smiled, he started to laugh, and he took off his headband, and he let his ears fall free. He didn't mind anymore who knew about those donkey's ears. He was, after all, still the king. But it was from that very day that anybody in the kingdom, if they had a secret hidden inside that they needed to tell, they couldn't tell anybody else. They could find their own tree and tell their secret to the tree. And the opposite is true as well. If you listen carefully to a tree, the right kind of tree, one that's ready to talk, then you might be able to listen to a story. And that's the story of the king's ears.